In 2024, Hurricane Helene had devastating effect on communities in North Carolina. Often, we think about hurricanes impacting communities on the coast, and they do, and it did. But Hurricane Helene also affected communities that were far away from the coast. And when we think about the folks that first respond to the damage from these kind of massive storms, we might think about the firefighters or the emergency medical support. Those are the folks that we think about as first responders. But we often forget about the people in our local community, the small business owners, the folks who work at the grocery store, hardware stores, local restaurants, the places that we often lean on in the face of a climate disaster. I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.
When they're coming up with their disaster plans, when they're coming up with their resilience plans. And this is more common in the areas that are hit by hurricanes. I think communities need to have a formal role for those small businesses in the communities. And I think that they need to think about what do they need to do to help them. And I think it's just not there.
I had a really interesting conversation with Kristen Fanarakis.
This is Kristen Fanarakis. I am with the Milken Insitute, and I lead a small business entrepreneurship and economic growth initiative.
Kristen herself has a small business, and she's also very aware of the role that small businesses played before, during, and after the hurricane.
We think about reinforcing bridges and we think about physical infrastructure. How do we update our building code, to make the community be able to withstand these disasters? But we're not thinking about the businesses that make up that community.
Because local businesses are locally situated, often run by local business owners with relationships in the community, they have the resources, the ability to organize quickly and to mobilize around what people need. And when their community is impacted, many of them leveraged all of those attributes to respond. We need to really think in advance about what communities will need from small businesses in the face of a major storm, not just after the fact. Once we see that small businesses are part of the infrastructure in our communities that create resilience, we also start to recognize the need to develop that infrastructure, to plan for it, to provide for it, to organize it, and to coordinate it. And how do we make sure that these businesses can survive and thrive, not only right after a major climate event, but into the future? And how do we start laying the groundwork so that small businesses can step forward and play an active role in their communities and be included in the way we think about resilience around the country?
I come to this work because I am a small business owner. I have an apparel line, and my manufacturer, which makes luxury clothing, they started making PPE like many of the other apparel manufacturers in the US when the hospitals couldn't get masks and things like that. And that was the story of the pandemic that I think most people have forgotten. But after a disaster hits, it really is those small businesses that are the first to step in and donate their time and resources. They are the community. They're not some outside person. They are serving and helping their neighbors. So we are focusing on the role of small business after a disaster. So it is not only how do we help improve their recovery rates, which are abysmally low, anywhere from 65 to 90%, depending on the studies that you look at. But we're also going to look at the role that they play in helping communities recover. And I would say that it's an underappreciated role that is not well studied from what I've gathered. Really, I think underappreciated in terms of the value they bring to a community in helping it recover overall.
So when we talk about disasters, we're talking about things like the fires that happened in California, the hurricanes that happened in Florida and the Carolinas. What are we picturing when we think about a disaster?
It's any and all of those. You saw similar things after the pandemic, and when global trade shut down, it was our small businesses across the spectrum who were stepping in and filling in to plug those holes. Whenever I talk about this and the important role, I always give the example from Helene, and you saw that area is dominated by small businesses, and you really saw them all stepping up after Helene. The pet store where I buy things for my dog, buy food for my dogs. It's a place called Patton Avenue Pet, and they donated food from their inventory. They helped coordinate donations for pets for people who lost their home, lost everything, couldn't get outside if you just needed food. And you saw this over and over again. The breweries there, for those that don't know, Asheville is Beer City, USA. You have hundreds, maybe thousands of breweries. They were bottling their water that they had until they could fly fresh water in because the storm took out the water system there. So there was no drinkable water. And then you saw the neighborhood where I lived, there's a restaurant named All Day Darling that cooked for weeks for free. But there's countless examples. I think that actually during the LA fires, I think LA Eater did an article on street taco trucks that were driving around to coordinate to feed the first responders and anybody else who needed something. So they are the community, and it's just really underappreciated, and why we need to do more to foster them, to save them, all of those things. It's not only that sort of aggregate level. Small businesses, startups, they're the main job creators, they're the engine of innovation, all of those aggregate things, but they're also extraordinarily important just down to the community level and helping provide stability, I would say.
It's interesting that you walk us through a range of different kind of emergencies that we experience in communities, and I think probably the widest one that we all experienced obviously was the pandemic. And I do think
Yeah.
for many people that is a very common story. Is if they live in a place that has a main street, they turn to their main street
Yeah.
to access those things that they couldn't get through all the channels that they often rely on, or those businesses, and they transformed overnight. In some ways, there were restaurants and they became delivery places. They could deliver food to people's homes because they're in the community. They're working in the community. They live in the community
Yep.
and they're figuring out how to survive and serve their customers and their neighbors. As you describe it, you help us see the businesses in our local communities in a very different way, like what role they play when we all need help when we're experiencing this disaster.
Yeah, exactly. I always think about who stepped up first. What happens if we don't invest in these? This is a long-term game. And what happens when we hollow out that I always you think about them as infrastructure. I think communities need to invest in these businesses. I always give the example. My cousin owns a restaurant in a small town, and when he wanted to expand his restaurant, he received no support from the city. Now, this is someone who is never going to leave the community. He is embedded in this community. His family is there, his kids are there, everybody's there except for me. I don't live there. But the community gave all sorts of incentives and tax credits and things like that to all of these franchises to come in from the outside, rather than supporting a homegrown business that sort of had very slowly scaled up. And he has a pretty big operation. And that and what's also overlooked is we about part of that is that we overlook that the money that we spend at our local small businesses, more of it stays in the community. And then it's almost like we need to think about these supporting small businesses as economic development. And I don't think communities are really community planners and policymakers and things like that. We're not thinking enough about how do we support what is already there? Because that is ultimately going to be better for our economy, for these local economies on a long term basis. We all know that the businesses from the outside, the franchises, if they're not making their revenue numbers, they're going to cut and run. We all know this is well studied. And so, yeah, so I just always try to bring it back to the economic case of why we need to do this. They are resilience infrastructure. And what happens when you hollow out that infrastructure? You can't get XYZ. We're all getting ready right now to prep for a winter storm. I ordered a couple of things online, shipments are already delayed. And so what happens when I can't go to the store down the road that has those things? And investing in small businesses, supporting small businesses, we often treat this as a charity. And I think we really need to think differently about how we support our small businesses, how we think about them.
And so if we think about small businesses, they play such a large role in our communities. They can be fragile in the face of disasters. Many don't survive when they go through this tremendous stress. And yet they also play such a critical role in helping the rest of the community survive or create the new version of normal after a disaster. What's the prescription that comes with that? How do we change what the nature of our relationship with small businesses?
I think, first of all, I think communities need to, when they're coming up with their disaster plans, when they're coming up with their resilience plans, and this is more common in the areas that are hit by hurricanes, Tornado Alley, all of these types of places in California with their fires. They have resilience plans in place. And I think the first thing is they need to have a formal role for those small businesses in the communities. And I think that they need to think about what do they need to do to help them. So, like, that first step to me is just an acknowledgement that they play a very important role, and those resilience plans need to be updated to account for that. These communities, they need to look at how many small businesses do I have in the community? What are they doing? Can you create an informal network or a formal network if a disaster hits? Because what you saw with Helene is everything just evolved organically. And that's what we see disaster after disaster because we seem to never learn. We seem to never prepare ahead. I think in an ideal world, I think that there are things that we need to do to make it easier, for small businesses post disaster. The faster we can get money and resources into small business owners' hands, the better we're going to improve recovery rates. And that's really what the issue boils down to is that the current system doesn't really allow for as quick of money as it could be. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So one of the recommendations that is in the paper that I wrote, and that's received a lot of traction. It is called Weather and Waste: Rethinking Small Business Support Following a Natural Disaster. You can find it on the Milken Institute's website, and the waste came from we spend so much time and money and, like, resources and effort to support small businesses, to spur entrepreneurship, all of these sorts of things. And what struck me is that we do very little for them after a disaster. So there's all these programs to sort of try to get small business owners going. And then we're just kind of leave them on their own. So that's where the waste came from. And it seems very obvious, but it doesn't exist, is creating some type of unified front door of resources for small businesses. Because Helene is really the best example of this because you had people who lost their homes, perhaps lost their business if they had a physical business. But then, even if you didn't lose either one of those things, there was no power, there was no water for months, there was very limited cell service. People were having to go around town to the satellite hotspots, and everybody would just congregate there trying to figure out, what am I eligible for? Am I eligible for grants? Am I eligible for a loan? What are those things? And having to navigate this Byzantine labyrinth. And this is a time in people's lives where it's probably the worst time in their lives. If, for many people, one of them, if not the worst. And you're trying to just figure out how to survive. We do nothing to make it easy. The states put up websites about the disaster, what's available, but many of those resources are the same resources. It's the same advice that's just getting recycled that somebody then has to go and hurry and scramble and pull them all together. So this idea of this, unified front door, and I think that it's not just about information and resources. Something like this can give a place, it can serve as a location to coordinate that help, to streamline the grants process. I went to a conference shortly after, but maybe about a month after Helene, and they had a lot of the entrepreneurs that were affected. It was a conference in North Carolina, so they had a lot of the business owners speaking at this event. And one guy, it stuck with me the whole time that one guy talked about how he had filled out at least 14 applications, all the same thing over and over and over again. And so how can we streamline that?
Right. Is that the critical issue, is how to get money to them more quickly post?
I think that's an important piece of it.
That's where you
I think that's an important piece, and I think there's phases after a disaster. The first thing you wanna figure out is what grants are available, and then figuring out if you wanted it to take a loan, things like that. But it's also just resources and advice of how to navigate that. There's a lot of small businesses where you have to figure out, is it worth continuing or not? And so a lot of times, and again, I've noticed this in Asheville where businesses stayed open for a while and then months later, 3 months later, 6 months later, 10 months later, they started showing. The fatigue started setting in. And I think you have to wonder, and it's like how much of it is just small business owner fatigue after a natural disaster, but how much of it is it's just really hard to get to the right resources in an efficient amount of time to get going again. It's not just about money. I think it's about I think the resources and advice and how should we be thinking about, okay, if I'm a restaurant, how can I get people in the door much quicker?
One of the amazing things to the small business owners are they're members of the community, and so they're there and they can be helpful and adaptive and responsive at the time of emergency. But also they're in the community, so they've also personally experienced the
Yeah.
disaster in many instances, and there are complexities to having survived a disaster that might show up 3, 6, 9 months down the road when all of those things that you've been relying on now need to be reconfigured. And so maybe we need to especially support them in that period after the emergency itself.
I think that there tends to be a lot of support post disaster, but it's the later months that we need a better coordination of resources. You have a little bit of a headline effect in this where as long as the disaster is in the headlines, people are paying attention. People are donating money. Philanthropy is paying attention. But once the next disaster hits, everybody's forgotten. You saw this with Helene. Once the LA fires hit, that was the only thing in the press. There was nothing. Everybody really completely forgot about kind of everything that the folks in Western North
So there's the
Carolina.
moment after when
Yeah.
yes, when
Yeah.
the people who have been affected by the disaster, they're still living with all the,
Yep.
ramifications, but the support that immediate outpouring of support may not be there for the longer term for them.
Yeah.
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 Are there models that you have in mind that are particularly pointed that we should be looking to, that we should be learning from?
I lived in Asheville for a while, and so I know the community. I still have ties to the community. And it really just came to me just looking at how disjointed people were. Oh, go here for this grant, go here for this grant. If you need X, go here. If there are models, I'm sure that there are. I am not aware of them. If that idea just came to me because it's just as an outside observer in all of this, it was just incredibly inefficient. I think one of the things that I bring to my work is I am a small business owner. And so I always think about what would I be doing in this or what
Right.
have I experienced and all of that. And so that's where the idea came from.
So in some ways, this really a frontier, this new area that we need to make progress on. This kind of open area where we need to people to step forward and
Yeah.
start to fill in what this could look like.
But when I was doing my research, I found a paper from that where there's I think they were academics out of Tulane. It was post Katrina. And they laid everything out, what was needed. It was like, okay, small businesses need more support in the first 3 months, but then they also need support in the later months. It's not new information. It's well studied, but what I didn't see is a lot of ideas on what does an actual implementable solution look like?
Interesting.
Yeah,
And who would be well poised to actually advance it and move forward.
exactly.
Fascinating.
Exactly. So I think that's a little bit of the question to explore at this point.
As you think of advancing this conversation, who do you go to? Who are you trying to reach out to? Who are you trying to bring into this conversation?
I think that any organization, whether it's corporates, whether it's philanthropy, who has an interest in supporting small businesses, because this is a niche area. Again, we provide, well, there's tons of philanthropies that have tons of, small business programs, but nothing post disaster. There's no dedicated fund. And so I think that corporations who rely on small businesses to survive, they should care about these things.
That's really interesting. And hearing you speak about the role of small businesses, giving us a new way to think about them, look at them, and see them. It also prompts us to reflect on our own experiences in a different way. I'm just as you're speaking, I'm remembering post Sandy, I remember nobody had electricity in the
Yeah.
Northeast, and including gas stations. And so then people had gassed up their cars knowing that there was an emergency, but because there was no electricity, the gas stations couldn't pump gas. And so
Yeah.
I remember being on miles long queues for the gas stations, and it was only small businesses who realized, oh wait, there's another business that has a generator that we can use
Yeah.
to actually run the gas station. But then the gas station had to borrow gas from another small business to get the generators up and running. So like it's these people who are situated in context who realize where they have networks, they have
Yep.
phone numbers, who are able to act, right? And
Yeah.
it was
And you see this, I feel like, in every disaster. One of the restaurant owners that I talked to when I was doing the research for this paper, a lot of the restaurants who were trying to open for the community in Helene, but they brought in outside water tanks. They were extraordinarily expensive. They were, I think it was like $20,000 to set it up, and then it was around $1 to $2,000 a day to run the water. You have to be doing a lot of turnover to really make this worthwhile. And she was telling me that she was from the community, so she had lots of other business friends, and so they went into a water sharing agreement to share the to de defray the costs. And that allowed 4 or 5 businesses to reopen. Rather than them all staying closed, they were all able to open. They were able to get their workers back part-time. But also the point that she made to me, "We're not making any money during this." "But we opened with the goal of being the community restaurant." And so it's a restaurant that's situated in a residential area. And you're not getting that from the franchise, and it's what happens if we had infrastructure in place to make this even more efficient.
and if you are listening to this, if you're a person in a community, a small business owner, a mayor, a local policy leader, or a corporation who relies on these local business and this infrastructure, what could you do? What active steps could you take?
I think you wanna have if I'm a mayor, I'm a community planner, economic developer, I think you wanna try to create this network of small businesses. Maybe it's just as simple as just an informal group or whatever who could be there after a disaster. And I would say you need a variety of businesses. We need to be able to feed people. You need the pet store just in case you need pet food, things like that. But I think it's almost like creating like a disaster board of directors to help coordinate. And then you can often, sometimes I think about it like the old school phone tree from many moons ago. All of those business owners, if you have that plan, then they can reach out to their own contacts. I think corporations, especially the ones who depend on small businesses for their own survival, there's many of those. And I think that they should be thinking about what role can they play in this? Can they be the platform, the coordinator of resources? And this is where name recognition is helpful because people are going to know you're going to go to the XYZ Small Business Disaster Recovery Hub if this is spearheaded by a large national corporation. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. I'm excited to keep going on this front. This paper came out almost a year ago, and it has received consistent traction, consistent attention. That reassures me that people are starting to think more proactively about this.
Kristen, I think that's a great capstone to the conversation. It's very thought provoking to think differently. And as you say, we're at the beginning of this journey,
Yeah.
but really interested to see where it goes because there's so many different stakeholders who have a vested interest in figuring out how to do this really well.
And at the end of the day, I think we all should be interested in that. We all should be interested in their survival. It's good economic development to support these businesses.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Really
Thank
appreciate it.
you. Thank you so much.
In Kristen's conversation, because she's from there and she focuses on small business, she has a small business. And she was also very aware of the role that small businesses played before, during, and after the hurricane. She runs a small business and she has a family and background that's from North Carolina. As we were talking about Helene and the impact it had, one of the things she was really aware of is also the role that small businesses played in helping others deal with the ramification of that storm. Because she sees small business and their roles in creating resilience. She highlighted that for me in this conversation in a way that really, once you start to see it, you can't not see it. Small businesses in some ways really are on the front lines in their communities of creating resilience. They're part, as she says, of the resilience infrastructure that's already situated in communities that are impacted by these incredible storms. We need to really think about it, not just after the fact and how do we make sure these businesses can survive and thrive into the future, but in advance. How do we start laying the groundwork so that communities, wherever they may be, the small businesses can step forward and play this role and have the support that they need to step into that? I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast.